right, just so everybody knows, I am recording this. I'm going to switch us to Enid, who's going to be speaking so that we get the video of her. If everybody else could just mute your microphones at least so that we have Enid and her presentation there. So I'm very, very honored and glad to have Enid Cardinal, who is here. She is the Senior Advisor to the President for Strategic Planning and Sustainability at Rochester Institute of Technology. She has been a friend to the planet and to us for a long time, and we're really, really glad to have her here. How we will be operating with this, I will be moderating the chat window, so if you have questions as Enid is presenting, feel free to put them in the chat window and I will, as appropriate, interrupt Enid. We know that might make for a sort of a non-linear path as far as the presentation, but as Enid said earlier, she would rather talk about things that you guys have questions about than to continue on with her excellent presentation. So hopefully we'll make through everything, and I'll also be sort of timekeeper as far as that goes. So welcome this evening. Thank you for your protocols and staying muted until asked to not be. And then I'm going to turn it over to Enid. So take it away, Enid. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. I will give an apology for my struggle with technology pretty frequently. So I work at an Institute of Technology, but it does not necessarily mean I'm good with technology. So bear with me if I accidentally shut something off or share the wrong thing or something along those lines. I will get it figured out. So I'm going to get into presentation mode and then share my screen. Except that when I did that, it made everything go away. So let me try this again. All right. I'm going to start with that. So let's go from beginning. And it did not. Give me 1 second here. Well, it's not giving me my presenter mode, but oh well. I'll work from it. I just won't be able to see my notes. All right, so this seems like a weightier topic than it would even normally be, just in light of our circumstances with COVID-19. So I've tried to weave a number of things together, and hopefully they will have the same feeling of connection as they do in my brain, but I can't promise that. We'll see how this goes. So first, just quickly, as we've been working remotely, I'm realizing the importance of really understanding the people that we're interacting with, not just the responsibilities of the people that we're interacting with. So just a different side of me than just my RIT hat. I am a lover of the great outdoors. That's me kayaking in a fjord in Norway. So my carbon footprint, I'm not proud of on that one, but I do love all things outdoors, and I have forever, as long as I can remember, and I inherited it from my mother, which I come to realize is an important thing to also acknowledge, is where your value system comes from. I'm also gonna give kind of a little look back at the first Earth Day, the context in which it occurred, so that we can get a better sense of where we are today and how we move forward. I will draw some connections with COVID-19. I think it's difficult to give any talk today in the current context without acknowledging the situation and the circumstances we're in currently. And then hopefully, I have more questions than I do a path forward, but they're things to think about as we think about what the path forward looks like. And hopefully it will enable a good discussion going forward. And again, feel free to ask questions, interrupt, clarification, anything at any time. So we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, which occurred on April 22nd, 1970. But to even understand where that came from, we need to look back before that. So we think about the 60s. I wasn't alive during that era. I studied a lot about it. I actually was a history major, among other things, in college, and I focused on Civil War and the 60s and civil rights movements. So I find this to be a really fascinating period of time, and I see a lot of parallels with the 60s and today, and some of the social challenges that we're still seeing today. And so it's important to acknowledge all of the things that were occurring in all of the contexts, because nothing happens in isolation. So we had the Vietnam War occurring and the anti-war movement. We had the civil rights movement and all of the conflicts and all of the violence associated with it, and all of the hidden violence that most people didn't know about until we're still learning about those. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy's assassination, the Civil Rights Act, the race riots that occurred right here in Rochester in 1964, the Voting Rights Act, the creation of Medicare, the Stonewall riots, which started the, some would say the LGBTQ, the gay pride movement, Woodstock, moon landing in 1969. And that leads us up to the first Earth Day. Oops, went backwards. The first Earth Day. But the other things that happened on the environmental front, Rachel Carson published A Silent Spring in 1962. The Clean Air Act actually was passed in 1963, though most people know of the 1972 Clean Air Act amendment. The Wilderness Act, there was actually a battle to put in 2 dams in the Grand Canyon in the 1960s, and the Sierra Club was the leader in stopping that movement. It's not even, I can't fathom putting in a dam in the Grand Canyon today, right? But this was something that was proceeding forward. So things have really shifted. The legal fight to ban DDT, interestingly, if you look at the photo in the corner of that cloud, that's actually them spraying DDT, and you see the people standing in the midst of it. Arguably, we've come a long way to recognize that's not a good thing and we shouldn't do that. And of course, the fire on the Cuyahoga River in Ohio, as well as a major oil spill in Santa Barbara. So this is the backdrop of the first Earth Day. Then Earth Day happened, April 22nd, 1970. And from that, and I have some clips that I'm going to show going forward, a few snippets here and there of Walter Cronkite's coverage of the first Earth Day that I've kind of tried to weave throughout. But from that, one of the things that he ends his talk with, and I'm not including that snippet, is we will wait and see if it was really actually successful. Well, in July of 1970, Nixon formed the EPA. The Clean Air Act was amended in 1970, at the end of 1970, to actually regulate air emissions. The initial Clean Air Act that was passed in '63 was actually so that they could monitor and study air emissions and the public health issues. So it wasn't, they didn't have the authority to do anything about those issues until 1970. Clean Water Act in '72, Endangered Species Act '73, Safe Drinking Water in '74. I include the Chipko tree hugger movement in there also because we hear this terminology, tree hugger, and I'm a self-identified tree hugger. I do literally every once in a while hug a tree just because it makes me happy. I have photos of me hugging trees in many places. But this was actually a movement of indigenous women in India that were trying to stop a deforestation from occurring, to basically cut old growth trees down to make cricket bats. And so I think that's actually an honorable title and descriptor, though many people often use it as a derogatory term in describing environmentalists. And then the Energy Policy and Conservation Act, which also helped to form the Department of Energy in 1975. And there's many, many more. But when I was watching some of the video clips from Cronkite, and almost every one of the snippets said, well, we'll see if this actually did anything. Clearly, the sentiment started to change. But was that sentiment because of Earth Day? Some say that sentiment was actually because of this photo, Earthrise, one of the first photos of planet Earth from space. When people started to recognize that we were all on that one small place, and that was the one space of life in a very large void. And you start to see your habitat in your home slightly differently. So many people believe that this photo did as much, if not more, than the Earth Day movement to start pushing legislation. It changed our perspective and it changed our understanding of where we live and what we have. So what did those regulations do? I went through the EPA site and just pulled emissions data over time and graphed it. So it's not a beautiful graph, it's because it's my Excel abilities here. But this is essentially what the EPA regulates and tracks and has over time. So nitrogen oxide and sulfur oxide emissions, particulate matters at the 2.5 and the 10, I think it's micron, my scales are not the best, volatile organic compounds and ammonia. Also carbon monoxide, but the number was so much higher in scale, you didn't see any of the trend lines, so I just removed the carbon monoxide. But what you see here is that the regulations worked, right? So there's oftentimes a question of, well, would it even do anything, and what do they do? And clearly, the regulations and the monitoring is effective. And so those regulations and that movement was successful to some extent. So there are things for us to celebrate. I show you this because the future graphs that I'm going to show you go in the opposite direction and aren't as encouraging. So I think I have to stop screen share and re-screen share here for a second so that I can show the other thing. Okay. I'm not showing this full clip, though. If you've got time on your hands, which many of us sort of do now because we can't leave our houses or go very far, it's a really interesting series to watch the full clip. They cover Earth Day across the US and the successes and the less than impressive turnouts in different places and how it was celebrated. I just want to call out one piece here.
Philadelphia, where an estimated 20 to 40,000 persons gathered in perfect weather in the city's largest park. It was an Earth Day success story, a major demonstration in a major city. But it did not come easily. There were many organizational problems, including a heated controversy over whether to accept financial aid from industries causing pollution. David Culhane followed the Philadelphia story from its start to today's colorful demonstration.
Fairmount Park in Philadelphia today is much like a rock music festival as a teach-in on the environment. A few older people, a few blacks, and some of the poor, but mainly white middle-class young people, as much aroused by the music as by the damage done to the environment by pollution. This is Philadelphia on Earth Day.
Welcome, sulfur dioxide. Hello, carbon monoxide.
Welcome, sulfur dioxide. Hello, carbon monoxide.
Okay. Back to my screen share. Okay. Can everyone see my PowerPoint again?
Yep.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay. So I clipped it there because what I wanted to show was the coverage of who was in attendance and who was part of it and who wasn't part of it. So as it said, it was largely white middle-class youth. And I think that's been a chronic problem of the environmental movement over time. In fact, as we look historically, some of the rationale for other communities not participating was the concern of distracting from their cause. Just the immediate issues with the Vietnam War, the immediate issues with civil rights, and many felt that the environmental movement was a way to distract from those so they could say they were doing something about something, but we're not fixing those issues. And to some extent, there's validity to that. So to really think about that, we have to think about whose environment and what is the environment that we're talking about. So I use this time as an opportunity to go through some photos from places that I've been so I could kind of have a nice distraction and revisit those places. But what I realized when I went through those pictures is all of my photos taking pictures of nature, right? That is my concept of the environment oftentimes. That's my framing of it pretty regularly, of animals, of water, of plants, of rock formations, and the awe of nature. But the reality is that this is also nature. And to some people, this is the only nature they know. They are more comfortable in this environment. Maybe they don't have access to get out of this environment. Maybe they just prefer this environment. But this is their environment. And our perception of the environment also depends on where we grew up, right? I have no idea what this guy is doing parachuting down this building, but I thought it was funny, so I just decided to include that as an interesting perspective on his environment. The reality is that we often look at this blue planet and we look at the green and the blue, and we forget about the gray parts that we as a society have built, and that those gray parts are part of the environment. So I showed these side by side when we see the light up of the planet Earth. The lights, the technology, those indoor environments, that is part of our environment. So when we're talking about the environmental movement and being able to conserve nature, we have to recognize all aspects of the environment. So where are we today? I showed the nice happy graph going downward on those emissions trends. Now I'm going to show the upward graphs. The things that we focused on and the things that we started regulating, those graphs started going down. It's the things that we weren't focusing on and the things we didn't know we needed to, and then all of a sudden they were politically difficult to. So this here is two graphs, one superimposed over the other. It's essentially global CO2 emissions over time. And you have your traditional hockey puck curve that we oftentimes see and talk about. And essentially the larger one is for the last 2,000 years, so really much of recorded human history. And it's pretty flat, as you see, the parts per million. And then this other one is going back several millennia. So you see the iteration. So we see that trend line, and then all of a sudden we start to see other similar curves, right? So this is temperature since the 80s, since 1850. This is carbon emissions, and this is broken down by country. So I put this in here because I want to call out, when we look at the United States here, it was definitely the largest chunk for a long time, and now we see China superseding us. But this is because of production emissions. So if we were to look at this by consumption emissions, looking at the emissions of individuals and attributing the emissions to the consumers, China's would be smaller and ours would be larger. We need to recognize that a lot of the manufacturing for the goods that we purchase and use are coming from China. So their emissions increase is still largely a result of our lifestyle, US and Western world's lifestyle. So this does a more representative example of really how you attribute those emissions, right? This is per capita. And some of well, I was going to say the global north, but then you see Australia there as well, with really intense, their carbon emission intensity is significantly higher along with ours. And a declining graph, which is not a positive one, it's really global biodiversity, living planet index, and looking at the diversity of species. And what we see is a decline in that diversity. One, I'm going to put in a plug here. You see a lot of these graphs, you see Our World Data. It's called ourworlddata.org. It's a really great resource. You can use a lot of these graphics and move them over timescales and by country. And so it really provides a great way to slice and dice data, which I'm a big fan of. And then if I needed to further emphasize that crazy curve, those kind of almost exponential growth curves, This graphic comes from the World Wildlife Fund's Living Planet report. They issue it, I think it's every 2 years, but it's a really fantastic resource in connecting dots. We oftentimes focus on individual issues, whether it's the climate, whether it's species loss, whether it's food availability or pollutants or water pollution. We're looking at them as an individual issue as opposed to an interconnected, holistic issue. And I think this report does a really great job of connecting those dots. So it kind of shows you a lot of these vital signs and shows you some of those, it's correlations, not causality, but shows you some of those correlations, but they're all very tied to what we see with the population growth curve, as well as the GDP growth curve, and then all of our emissions increases. Where else are we today? We have seen a lot of marches. We've seen a lot of issues that are really starting to bubble up in importance. Not that they were ever not important, but people finally taking to the streets because they're so frustrated over these issues and marches. Not unlike the 60s and the marches that occurred, though, for different aspects of similar issues. But what we see here is similar to what we saw with Earth Day in 1970, which is they're issue specific and they're not exactly overly diverse in their movements, right? There's whether they be gender specific, whether they be racially specific, whether they be age specific, there isn't necessarily that broad of a diversity in who you're seeing showing up at these. And of course, we also have wonderful, these headlines were obviously taken before early March. I snipped these, I think I pulled these from a different slide. I snipped them probably back in November-ish when I was going through. So we see a lot more complexity in the issues that that we're trying to address from an environmental perspective these days, or that we're trying to call attention to. There's a lot more scientific understanding that needs to be tied to some of these, or just a different systems perspective for people to really pay attention to some of these issues. So how did we get here? I have a little activity that I want to do. I am going to just ask you to share in the chat box a question here. And I'm going to give you, let me see, I'm going to pull my phone up here and put my timer on. And I'm going to show you a slide and give you a minute to see how many answers you can get right. So take a look at these. How many of these logos do you recognize from one simple letter? You don't necessarily have to write them all down, but I want you to look at them and count how many you don't know, because I'm guessing you know fewer. There's fewer that you don't know than you do know. So I'm giving you a minute. I just spend a little time looking at this and see how many you can get. And then I would like you to just post in the chat box how many you don't know from this. Okay, there's a minute. So, see a bunch in here. Ranging anywhere from about 2 to 7, 1 to 7, it looks like 1 to 8, okay. Anyone wants to add any last ones in there? Now I'm going to reveal the answers. Oh, so there's 20 that I put up there. I had a longer one, but I wanted to shorten this just for time purposes. So most people recognized more than not. There was a couple that I had to look up that I didn't know the answers to, but most of them I knew the answers to. Now let's try this again with a different set of images. And this time, I'm going to ask you to tell me how many you do know in the chat box. Ready? Set the minute. How many of those can you identify? Okay, there's a minute. And I see that last message of, wow, that is sobering, which I definitely appreciate. So, ready for the answers on this one? So there was only 12 in here, and I gave you the same amount of time to try and figure out the answers. Some of them are food that we eat and may not have been recognizable. And one of them is even an allergen, and to some people extremely toxic. And oftentimes people can't even identify that one. But my guess is that you were able to identify a lot more from this slide than from this slide. So what does that tell you about what is wrong with the direction of our planetary vital signs? I'm going to show you another quick clip. I think that I'm sharing the full screen, so I think I just have to end this and pull into this.
Founder and co-sponsor, Senator Gaylord Nelson, offered a more specific plan.
We elect an ecology Congress as the 92nd Congress, a Congress that will build bridges between our citizens and between men and nature's systems, instead of building more highways and dams and new weapon systems that escalate the arms race. Environment is all of America and its problems. It's the rats in the ghetto. It's a hungry child in a land of affluence. It is housing that's not worthy the name and neighborhoods not fit to inhabit. Environment is a problem perpetuated by expenditures of tens of billions of dollars a year on the Vietnam War instead of on our decaying, crowded, congested, polluted urban areas that are inhuman traps for millions of people. If our cities don't work, America won't work. And the battle to save them and end the divisiveness that still splits the country won't be won in Vietnam.
Okay.
This is a CBS News special, Earth Day.
Okay. Bring this back up. Toggling between screens is not as easy as I thought. Okay. I think there are so many parallels, and you could almost just plug in a few different words, and that message would be as accurate today as it was then. And he hits the nail on the head in that we're looking at systems in the wrong way, and we're disconnecting our systems, and we're spending our money in places that aren't necessarily going to benefit our environment, and our environment in the most holistic sense of the term. So some of the issues on why we got where we are is that we know more about marketing and brands and human systems than we do about the plants that surround us and the natural systems that support everything that we need to survive. The teaching that occurs in our schools and in our institutions of higher learning, and I am a part of those systems, are taught through disciplines. So you learn different aspects of different scientific disciplines and different social science disciplines. And you don't necessarily get to see those full connections across the disciplines. You can't have biology without chemistry. You can't have chemistry or biology without physics, yet they're taught as separate subjects. And I understand the split, but until we can make those connections and really reinforce those pieces throughout our educational system, we'll continue to think of things separately. And we also need different people at the table to help solve the problems. We have the same people when I go to meetings, when I go to environmental topics, when I go to whatever events they are, we have the same people showing up to them. And so we wonder where other people are. The reality is we need to show up to those other topics and to those other events. We need to understand their challenges, and we need to understand how it all connects so we can find ways to move forward differently. Oops, I went backwards. So one of the things, again, that we see these vital signs, we don't necessarily connect the dots to our choices, or this is kind of just showing some of the siloed thinking here. So I'm not going to harp on this one. It's really just essentially us understanding that our decisions, it's not just the energy that we put in our car or use for our houses that impact our carbon footprints, but really everything that we consume, everything that we use on a day-to-day basis is tied to those emissions, is tied to those environmental vital signs that we need to pay more attention to. And it ties to the economic piece. So this I pulled from NOAA, and it's essentially, it's another really great interactive website. But oftentimes we've got to talk in terms of dollars and cents, right? So this is looking at what is the cost of the increasing the natural disasters that are occurring, whether and the extremes that they're incurring in. What are the costs associated with those? And this graphic shows you expenditures on national disasters just here in the US from 1980 to I think it's 2018. And it's adjusted for inflation, so it's trying to put them in the same real dollars for comparison. And so you can see that trend line dramatically increasing. Some of that is because of development that is in places that it shouldn't be, and more congested areas and more higher property values. But there's definitely a real increase in cost there. I like this one because it really makes you think. So what you see on the one side here is the comparison of the amount of road space you need for different modes of transportation, whether it's biking, a bus, you can obviously walk into, or cars. We oftentimes hear the conversation around electric vehicles and the need to shift our transportation infrastructure to electric. That addresses one issue, and that's going to be part of the solution. But it still requires the same amount of infrastructure, the same amount of roadway, and the same amount of costs and capital expenditures to maintain those spaces. This is going to be an important point when I kind of bring things towards COVID-19. So it's an important perspective, right? If we're only solving for one problem, we're not going to address the holistic issues in front of us. This is another one that I love. You see our graphic here, you got this guy over here with a ton of containers, and it says, we help the environment by consuming lots of environmentally safe products. And you see this guy with one bin, one small bag, and we help the environment by consuming less. The reality is that a lot of the challenges that we are facing today are tied to our consumption behavior. When we think about 9/11 and our recovery, it was go shopping. That's how you can help the country. As opposed to when we think of World War II, the victory gardens, plant victory gardens, grow food. We're talking about go shopping to keep the economy going. And that type of thinking leads to kind of a disjointed solution. It's suggesting that first we need to make money, and then we can fix the problems created by that, as opposed to how can we make money and address the problems all at the same time? How can we run our economy in a way that doesn't generate all of these challenges? So then we get to today. There's a lot of interesting connections when we think from the environmental connections between COVID-19 and some of the issues that we think about with climate change. But one of the interesting things, my other major in college was biology, and I was pre-med, so I love microbiology, and I really like geeked out on this when I was trying to think about this presentation. But there's scientific models out there that are estimating there's 500,000 zoonotic viruses that are out there. Zoonotic viruses are essentially viruses that connect, that can bridge species. So that can, and the 500,000 are ones that can bridge a species to humans. This is the estimated projection based on historic knowledge, right? Well, how are these things occurring? And if we think historically about human civilization and colonization, colonists brought viruses and introduced them into new lands, right? Or they were exposed to viruses and there was die-offs. What's happening as we develop into areas that previously hadn't seen humans, we increase the risk of exposure to animals that may carry these types of viruses. And so we increase the risk of this entire situation occurring again, and it's likely that it will. As we continue our exploration for more minerals, for more oil, for more materials of all sorts, we're moving into places that we haven't been before. And even if it's only a mine site, you have to make roadways to get there. And as long as those roadways are requiring large vehicles versus bicycles, you're putting in a pretty big impact in those inroads, right? And the deforestation that's occurring because of grazing livestock. Pigs are another common species that can have carryover viruses. And so when we're grazing livestock, or when we're producing these types of livestock, we're increasing our exposure risk. But these also are things that have negative impacts on the climate, right? This development, the deforestation, the livestock production, all have very strong and negative impacts on carbon emissions. Another thing that scientists and the medical staff are seeing is that patients that have had higher exposures to air pollutants have had more severe reactions to the disease. They have more vulnerabilities to them. And we also see that populations of color have more severe cases. And there's most likely a pretty strong case to be made that those two things are connected, because what we often see are populations of color in places that have worse air pollution, right? Whether they're near an interstate with a lot of traffic, or they're near a very heavily polluting or emitting factory, they're downwind of something or another. They oftentimes, minorities and populations in poverty tend to be the ones that have the most exposure to these things and therefore are experiencing a lot of the brunt of it, which when we track that to climate change, that's another reality that we see, right? It's our populations in poverty that are going to be the least able to respond to climate change, and they're the ones that are the most vulnerable to it. So some of the similarities, and this is just, me on a brain dump, this wasn't any deep dive research, but some of the similarities I've seen is that, the scientific experts weren't listened to here either, and they were attacked for the information they were providing, just like climate scientists have been. We also see that boundaries don't matter. Air emissions don't care about boundaries, and neither do viruses. They care about the human contact or the human actions. And oftentimes we're seeing economic decisions being prioritized over science. We're trying to push those economic decisions to be prioritized over science. We can also recognize that the cost of preventing or acting early would be a lot less expensive than having to react. And when we think about what the economy is going to look like when we're allowed to come back together in some way, shape, or form in a post-COVID society, there's going to be a pretty heavy economic impact because of it. And if actions had been taken earlier, if the scientists had been listened to, those expenses might not have been as severe. Scientists on the pandemic side also find that challenge in needing to find a balance in the message that they're giving. The sky is falling, warning everyone, versus not saying enough and then being called out for it. And so how do you juggle that? I saw an interesting and disturbing statistic when I was going through some of this, in that when COVID-19 was first making landfall here in the US in a more measured way, it was happening right around the same time as Kobe Bryant was killed. And so there were, in the course of a day, there were over 100 news articles about Kobe Bryant and his daughter, and there were less than 30 about COVID-19 on that given day. And it shows how consumers of news and information are prioritizing what it is they're paying attention to. And that's kind of, it's upsetting, but I think about myself, and when I'm a huge basketball fan, when I was watching the NCAA March Madness and the games getting canceled, that was when I was going, well, this is going to be a long one, because this is really serious. But it wasn't until sports got canceled that even I, with a scientific background, looked at this and said, wow, this is really serious. So part of it is who the messenger is and who's going to listen to, who's delivering the message for the audiences that need to hear it, right? And again, both for COVID and climate change, we have some pretty steep curves that we need to flatten. And I think we're starting to see that we can successfully flatten the COVID curve. So can we successfully flatten the climate curve? The big differences here, and these are what make it more challenging to think about, is really time scale, right? So we can really see the impacts of COVID, right? You can see illness, you can see death in our lifetime and in days and weeks, not generations, not decades. And we know the exact culprit. It's a virus. We can see it under a microscope. We've seen photos of it. With climate change, that culprit is really hard to look at, because ultimately, if we think about it, the culprit's us, right? We don't necessarily want to look in the mirror at this one. And with COVID, there's a very clear connection to our own personal health and well-being, which is a pretty strong motivator to get us to do what we need to do to flatten the curve. And there's also really clear solutions. The hand washing, the face masks, the distancing, and then also a potential vaccination and therapeutics that can come out from the situation. Whereas in climate change, when we think about solutions, there's trade-offs with pretty much every solution we have to think about. I think about when I chat with students in classes and they ask a question, my answer always starts out with, it depends. It's not an easy thing for the general public to understand, and that's a challenge we have to figure out how to contend with. So going forward in our post-COVID-19 world, I am the eternal optimist. So I always try and look to see what is possible versus what's not possible or what's going to be hard. What we've seen is that we are capable of taking dramatic action when we understand what's needed and when something is imminent. So the question is, how do we make people understand that climate change is imminent and in their timescale and directly impacting them? We've seen some major supply chain disruptions. So coming out of COVID-19, will manufacturing, will industry, will buyers start to recognize that there's a case for local sourcing and local production? What will those supply chains look like afterwards? Because this laid bare how vulnerable we are in a globalized supply chain. We can also expect some stimulus dollars coming out of the federal government. And can we be prepared to advocate with our leadership, all of them, whether we like them or not, for a Green New Deal? If we are investing in stimulus dollars, we're investing in something to jumpstart the economy. Let's jumpstart an economy that we can live with and create jobs that people can live and thrive with, rather than making people sicker with. I think that this is going to be a time for us to rethink how we work and play, and maybe our transportation needs change, and maybe driving back and forth to work every day for everyone, maybe that's not the case. I don't think that everyone is going to opt to stay home and work, and in most cases they won't be able to, but maybe we start to look at different schedules, and maybe we start to look at different commuting models. Really, it's a question of what our new normal will be. And, you know, some of that is also people's fear of germs. We're going to see, and we've already seen some advocacy by the plastics industry to bring back disposables and single-use items because it's good for you. It's protecting your health and preventing germ transmission. And that's really not the case, but we need to be prepared to combat those arguments. And maybe science will once again be respected, right? We've been living in a time where science is under fire and under question. And I think the reality people need to recognize is the scientific models that have been projecting the COVID-19 spread and the science that we're using to figure out how to create vaccinations and antibody tests is the same science that's predicting climate change, that's modeling climate change, that's helping us identify solutions. So how can we make those connections more apparent to people? And how can we make a scientist a rock star instead of paying attention to that basketball player? Wouldn't it be amazing for people to be, you know, the influencers to be scientists instead? And I think importantly, this whole experience has really helped us recognize our shared vulnerabilities and our shared humanity, right? We are all connected, and you see all of these statements of we're all in this together. We really are, right? This is a tragedy of the commons in some examples, and that's the same with climate change. If one person is a bad actor, it's going to negatively impact everyone else. And so getting everyone to recognize that we have to act in an interest of everyone, even if it doesn't feel like it's necessarily in our best interest in the immediacy. I think people are starting to recognize that. And I think that maybe we'll get a chance to start seeing more civility come out of this. And I think that, you know, we've got to be that change, right? We need to try and find ways to drive that change. And from it, when we think about a Green New Deal, what we need to be thinking about is systems level change. Like what Gaylord Nelson was talking about, that connection between man-made systems and natural systems. We need to recognize that all parts matter and all parts impact the other. So if you're not familiar with and I'm assuming this is kind of a choir that I'm preaching to at the moment, but if you're not familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, this is really my context for when I'm talking about sustainability. I try very hard. to emphasize the fact that sustainability is not about the planet. It's going to be here, whether we are or not is really what's in question, right? We're talking about species survival, and it's our species. And in order for our species to survive and thrive, we need to be able to address all of these pieces and recognize that all of these pieces are interconnected. You can't fix one without either fixing or negatively impacting another. So we need to find ways to think in systems and recognize the connections and evaluate our decisions differently so that we are taking all of these aspects into account. I'm essentially making the case for a more circular economy, designing our economy, our manufacturing systems, our building infrastructure in a way that's more reflective of nature, right? Nature doesn't have waste in it. There's the waste equals food, right? One plant's or animal's waste is another's food. And how do we design a society that we can live in that is similar in that concept, so we don't see the ocean or the atmosphere just being a dumping ground?
Someday, we heard today, the world will be a better place if it listens and acts. But in the meantime, perhaps for a generation or more, it will be frighteningly costly to each of us to clean up the mess each of us has made. But the cost of not doing so is more frightening. That's what today's message really means. And those who marched today, and those who slept, and those who scorned are in this thing together. What is at stake and what is in question is survival. This is Water Crime Guide. Good night.
I couldn't help but tie that in when I saw his ending of "we're all in this together." It tied so perfectly as we're seeing all these statements with COVID-19. But it's also, it's heartening and frustrating when I look back at these, because they're saying all the things we know. The problem is that the same people know this information. How do we bridge the gaps? How do we go from this, which are all separate movements that we need to understand are all very connected, to this? We need to find a way to remove the exhaustion from every issue, right? It's, some people will say, I can't fight for everything because it's just too tiring, so this is my issue. Well, this issue can't happen without recognizing all of these other issues are tied in together. And so I think that our challenge moving forward, and what I challenge you to think about, because you've got, fewer distractions these days in meetings outside of the home, is expanding your circle. Think about a movement, an issue that you may not have necessarily tied to your environmental interests, and think about how they're connected. I've been doing my best to just read very different books and try and I'm watching a lot of TV, unfortunately, so I'm trying to watch a lot of documentaries, but really trying to understand other things so I can better see those connections and hopefully be a better advocate for the changes that we need. So I think that is the end of my slides. Yes. So with that, I will open for questions.
What young people can do to make a difference.
Yeah. Can I just have one fun thing first?
Young people in a Trump school.
Enid?
Yes.
If I could, just one fun thing. You mentioned the War Gardens as a World War II creation. You recognize that poster?
Have your victory. Yes.
Every garden a munition plant. This is from the Ward Gardens Victorious book. It happens to be written by my great-grandfather. He was the chairman of the War Gardens Commission in World War I.
Oh, wow.
So there's a little family pride in getting that one right. Nobody does, so.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, I've been saying we need to start cultivating COVID gardens at this point in time. The second that this hit, the first thing that I did was pull out all of my raised bed stuff and any potters that I could and started planting greens. I was like, my reaction was how I needed to respond to the situation.
CBS had a piece on it about three or 4 weeks ago that was on the movement towards victory gardens. They gave credit, much more credit to World War II because it's more recent memory and a little bit of a nod to the World War I War Gardens Commission. I've got a lot of other questions, but I'm not going to dominate. So,
how do we want to do this, Terry? Anyone just fire out questions, or I don't know what the best approach is, but happy to talk and answer, or just dialogue.
How about if you can either put it in the chat, or there's a way that you guys can, if you are over your set, you can raise your hand, right? And we can call on you as you raise your hand, and then just feel free to unmute and ask your question. And I can help control that over there. But in the meantime, yeah, you can go ahead and put it in the question. There we go. I'm just in the chat, sorry.
Can I just go, Terry?
Go, Laura. Yes, sorry.
That's okay. So as a teacher, and with it being, you know, Earth Day tomorrow, we're having a lot of celebrations in our homerooms. And if you could give me one message to give our students here at Harley, what would the one message be to convey?
That's hard. But I mean, at this point in time, it's kindness to each other and to every species. And I don't know how you necessarily teach that, but that's ultimately what we need.
Well, I think that goes along with empathy, and we do a lot of that. So I think it's good. I think one of the things that I got out of this, at least, is how it all ties together. So society, people, the environment, we're all connected. And I think like showing that picture of the Earth made it clear to me, like we're one world. And so
one of the activities that I do with students when I'm trying to introduce them to this, to the systems thinking approach with sustainability is
are we muted or not?
Full of yarn, and I give everyone a different issue topic, whether it's environmental, whether it's social, whether it's economic, and they have to make a connection to something in the circle until the whole spool of yarn is this messy web that you have to somehow or another untangle. It's difficult to do virtually, but I think that there's ways that you can do some visualization that way, even virtually. But that's one of the ways that I try and draw that systems thinking out with students.
Great. Karen Berger, you had a question.
You're on mute.
Sorry, thank you. Still not used to Zoom, or I'm used to running the class. So I get that question a lot, and I feel like something that resonates for me right now is that the individual actions really do matter, right? Just like you can see those visuals of how one person staying inside can prevent so many different infections. Trying to translate that to, you know, the individual actions that we do on, you know, whether it's you know, the food that we choose to eat or the way we choose to transport ourselves, so that they feel some empowerment. Because I think you had a lot of fantastic points, Enid, and I think the idea that it is, you know, it's hard to see those sort of personal impacts is a challenge.
One other thing that I'm thinking of, thanks Karen, it kind of drove me to it. We had to figure out how to virtually celebrate Earth Month for RIT, and with so many activities that students were being pushed online to do, we didn't want to tell them to spend more time online with us. So we were trying to, you know, we've got sustainability bingo that they can do, like different activities that they can do. But we also just created a team for RIT. We found students, faculty, alums are all participating in the Eco Challenge, which was a month-long challenge, but it's just committing to a few activities here and there. But the nice thing about it is that it adds up those activities and anyone else is on your team. So it helps to visualize some of that cumulative impact. So that's another kind of opportunity to drive some of that local self-behavior.
This is Terry Platt. Can I ask a question?
Go, Terry.
Hi, we're not on our video, and we'd have to get out and get back in. I wanted to raise two particular questions and offer two particular possible solutions or ways, directions to go. The two questions are, for each of us, what is it that we are most capable of being able to help fix? And then the second part of that is, how are we going to pay for it? And the two solutions that would help in the second direction in terms of paying for it, and I've been thinking about this for a while, and this is because of the oil crisis, this in fact is a great time. The federal and state, the federal in particular, gas tax has not been raised in over 20 years. And if you were to charge 2, 3, 4 cents a gallon, you would raise millions, if not billions of dollars. And now that gas is so low, 5 years ago or whenever it was that gas was $4 a gallon, people would scream, oh no, not more taxes. But these days you can hardly complain about another, say, nickel a gallon. And so it costs you, 50 cents for 10 gallons of gas. Wouldn't you pay that to have better roads, better infrastructure? And that money could go towards, restoring our infrastructure. And the second thing that's not my idea, but was in an editorial, I think in the New York Times in the last 2 days, was let's have a wealth tax. So everybody over $30 million, you don't hit the small fry, you hit the top 0.1% or 0.5% of the population who own 50% of the wealth in the United States. And you ask them to pay 5%. So everyone over 30 million pays 5%, which would be $6 million each. And you could raise not just millions, but trillions of dollars that way. So in each of those cases, we can pressure our representatives in both Congress and the Senate to, bring these topics up and start to discuss them. And you can spread the ideas among friends, relatives, people who vote, people who just want to write letters and make a difference.
Yeah, I think that with the oil prices down, it is an opportunity to kind of sneak some of that in. The one vulnerability that we have with that is when you shift over to alternative fuel sources, they're not paying a gas tax or infrastructure. So they've actually been seeing the infrastructure coffers go down because of increased, electric vehicles, those kinds of things. I've even seen an interesting proposal, and I don't know if it was in the Times or it was an op-ed piece, but the oil prices or the oil companies steal right now. And what if the federal government were to purchase the oil companies and use the reserves financial reserves to shift to a renewable future and then turn it into a public good? It would never happen, but it's an interesting.
Yeah, good idea.
I don't have a hand raise function on my screen for some reason, so when you have time,
Go ahead,
let
Jim.
me know. I've always been struck by the well of support from the '64 Wilderness Act, which was overwhelmingly approved by bipartisan majorities in Congress. In New York State, we have the Wild, Scenic, and Recreational Rivers Act, and '76, I think, our own Environmental Quality Review Act. We have the Wetlands Act. All of these passed with bipartisan support in the '70s. That support I've witnessed it firsthand in my previous job, which was also an act that had fairly wide support at the time. Why is that, and what's the future of more bipartisan support for improved environmental legislation?
It's interesting looking at it historically, because the conservative movement, the conservation movement, grew out of the conservative Republican Party. I mean, the EPA was established under Nixon, right? And Teddy Roosevelt, the national parks, Roosevelt was a conservationist, but he was a Republican.
But that's I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that's really a misstatement to characterize Teddy as a conservative. And
well, what I was going to say is we've seen a shift in what that term means and what the party represents.
Yeah,
and
yeah, that's true. Yeah.
As we've seen this evolution, that bipartisan support change, I think it's in part because of the new thinking from Reaganomics and the new right that kind of arose in the I think what we see historically is kind of swings, right? We get pendulum swings. The 60s and the 70s led to radical changes. Some people were really happy about those changes, and some people that might have been more established were not so comfortable with those changes. And what you saw in response, the 80s, Reaganomics and the new right was really a push back against all of those changed values that arose in the 60s and 70s. And I think that we saw the rise of more partisanship coming out of that with those swings, and the swings seem to be getting more and more extreme. And, you know, I blame the two-party system. I also blame the change in the broadcasting requirements, right? Under Reagan, before Reagan, you used to have to give fair and balanced, and under Reagan, when the rules changed around media communications and enabled more hyper-partisan media, you started to see even more partisanship, right? So there's evolutions of a lot of things that have led to this, but again, all of those connections, it's pull on one thing and it changes something halfway around the world.
What I thought you might add to that is the voices that you highlighted in the Philadelphia clips all look like us, and that the rise of attention to folks who don't look like us and don't share, haven't been brought up in nature movements, in a sense of ecology and reverence for the outdoors.
I don't know that that's necessarily fair. I think that one of the challenges is in the traditional conservation movement, it's really preservation. It's preserve nature over here, and then there's people over here. When we look at indigenous communities and when we look at in many other cultures, they're part of nature. And so this conversation about owning it and owning the resources to it make no sense to them. And how we celebrate and how we participate in nature has really, our mainstream environmental movement comes really from middle-class white culture. But we also need to recognize that a lot of the infrastructure that was built in our park systems was built by people of color that were then told they weren't allowed to be a part of that. So we need to acknowledge that history in order to recognize that we need to find a way to bridge that to come back to common language.
Yeah, no, I was sort of agreeing with that. I think, oh no, I've forgotten the point that you made me think of oh, I know, Bill McKibben would disagree. Humans are the problem with nature. They aren't part of nature. So anyway, I'll be quiet for a while.
Terry, can I jump in?
Well, maybe. Yes, go ahead.
Well, so the question I have is that I think 5 or maybe 7 or maybe even 10 years ago, there were a lot of sort of thought experiments about, what if we vanished? Like, how quickly would Manhattan turn back into, a marsh or whatever? And I read a couple different ones like that. And this period feels a little bit like that. You see photography of Los Angeles, and it looks like a city you've never seen before. It looks so different. And last night I saw a photograph of the sunset over the Hudson, somebody standing completely alone on the West Side Highway. And I guess I just wonder, Enid, if you've been interested in I don't know, the way the planet is responding to the moment, the massive cutback in the amount of pollution being, kind of belched up into the world. And I don't know if you take any perspective on that.
So I've definitely been watching it with interest, but I also think it almost makes our case a little more difficult, because what we see is, sure, people aren't here, everything's fine. Well, we're not going to just go away, right? And so if the only solution is that we cease to exist, or we have to live under these circumstances, nobody's going to want to do it and just live for today. So it reinforces how resilient nature is, and it's no surprise to me that these changes can happen so quickly. And on one front, it gives me hope, because it shows that because of the resiliency of nature and how quickly it responds, that changes that we make today, we could see some real change, we could see some real positive impacts. But I fear that it will be used against the argument in saying, well, this is the only way you're going to fix it, and we're not going to do this again. So it worries me.
Yeah. And if I could have just one other quick question. I was struck by, in your presentation, the kind of cultural and even racial or ethnic sort of lining up behind some of the different sort of protest causes, and how it worries me that everything's politicized and everything is turned into part of culture, these days. And I'm wondering if you're plugged into counterexamples that might be, I don't know, a little cheerier, or would give us hope, or maybe point us in a particular direction.
I think that one of the great things about working at a university, and a pretty diverse university, is that I see students from all backgrounds and socioeconomic, racial, religious backgrounds that come together on a lot of topics that they all care about. And actually climate change is one of them, that I see the younger population a much more diverse representation of that. I think the challenge with the environmental movement really is that it's, it was viewed as white man's burden, right? We caused this problem, we're wealthy enough to worry about it now, and now we're going to tell everybody else that they have to deal with what we're telling them is the problem and the solution, right? That just isn't going to fly anymore, and it shouldn't. We need to engage with other communities, and that means that we can't expect them to show up to meetings we schedule to talk about this issue. We first need to show up and let them know that we actually care about what matters to them and what the real problems they're facing. It's really difficult to make a case to address, I don't know, the water level, sea level rise that might impact people 30, 40 years from now, when there's communities that have real issues with their water supplies today. It's hard to make them support infrastructure investments that aren't going to impact them today, and they need those fixes now. So we need to recognize that those things have to be prioritized first.
Can I jump in? Just because I wanted to mention something that you just talked about, Enid. Hi, everyone. Most of you don't know me, but my name is Samra Brook. And one thing and I'm also running for state senate, but I won't get political. But one of the things that I keep talking about with folks around climate change is, and a quick background, I worked abroad in developing countries, and you saw how people in different countries dealt with their environment and their trash pickup and things like that, right? And that urged me when I moved back here to work in recycling education so that I could help with that in the early 2000s. And now that I'm, looking to create some of these policies, I think a way of kind of describing what you're saying, Enid, is the way I see it, it's a lens through which you see everything. Because as a policymaker, you can't just focus on one issue, right? You have to be thinking about all these intersectionalities, and to understand that there are people who, like you say, just want water to drink, to hydrate their children, and to be safe and not have things like lead poisoning and things like that. And then there are folks who have more psychological space to think about rising water levels or 40 or 50 years. But it seems like one of those things that seems like a lot of folks on this call may have thought about equity in the same way, where is it a lens that you can approach everything with? And I wonder if anyone else has had, that thought, and what their reaction is to think, can we think of everything but with a lens of climate change? Because it's something that, like COVID-19, doesn't spare anyone, right? Because we're all the same species.
That's a really great question and perspective. And I have to say, I think I kind of eat, sleep, and breathe this stuff. So I think that I do tend to use that lens when I'm doing things. But one of the things I also was thinking about is that the majority of emissions that are out there and the climate change issue, the crisis that we have in front of us, is largely created by us. And by us, I mean the United States, right? And by us in the United States, I mean affluent populations, which are largely white. When we look at the solutions that are going to occur, what we really should be doing is walking into other communities in this country and others and saying, what can we learn from you? Because your footprint is way smaller than ours. And I think we need to recognize that there is knowledge from other communities and other people to help us solve other challenges that may not be immediately connected to carbon emissions, but may be indirectly connected. And so I think it is that bigger systems level thinking that we have to find a way to make the norm.
Anybody else have any other questions? I know there were a few that were just addressed by the last few. Go ahead, you're welcome to unmute if you want to. And
Hi, this is Terry Platt again. I guess I'd just like to point out that climate change sort of bridges all these areas because, as Enid just said, COVID-19 is the same issue. And I would love for the Democratic Party in the upcoming elections to really seize upon climate change as an issue that will bridge all the divides and will be independent of which side of the aisle you're on for exactly those reasons. And one of my reasons for really wanting to push this and spread the word is that, at least as long as Trump is the head of the Republican Party with his cronies, the Republicans are not going to take this issue up unless they're forced to. And so it's a wide open field, unlike many of the other things like economics, where there's reasonable grounds for argument on both sides and so forth. And in fact, the majority of the US population, as far as I can tell from all the polls I've seen, is something like 60% or more of the US population thinks climate change is a big issue. So I think the Democrats would be idiots not to really put that front and center as the headstone of their, and I don't mean headstone in the grim sense, although it potentially is, of everything else, and weave everything else in there because it affects everybody. Thank you.
I also just wanted to add that I just really am grateful for you today and everyone here.
A good way to bring in Earth Day.
I just, Enid, wanted to thank you again, along with Terry and everybody else it would be easy for you to turn this down because of everything that's going on. And I mean, I'm always impressed and appreciative of everything you do, but I just want to say again, thank you so much for taking the time to share these sort of important, powerful words that you had to share. So thank you so much.
No, thank you. It was actually a really, it was an enjoyable exercise in trying to dig into some of these things to get my mind to train away from some of the COVID-19 stuff, but also, again, bridging those gaps and kind of tie a lot of parts of my personality together with the biology and the history and the environmental stuff. So thank you for the invitation. I enjoyed it.
all right, fabulous. Maria Frigiueli is just putting information in the chat about a webinar that she's got next Wednesday. And I think there's lots and lots of Earth Day, Earth Week, Earth Month events going on. And so we're so grateful, Enid, for you to take your time to do this, and also ways that everybody here, I mean, I think what's great about these, whether we're remote or whether we're at Harley, is that the room is full of people who have commonalities, and it's interesting to see who shows up and who's here. And I think that it's great to see the connections and to see some Venn diagrams being built out as far as who knows each other and all of that. So appreciate all of you taking your time. I have most of you, I think I have your emails because of the registration, but we will send the recording out. And Enid, if it's all right, we can go ahead and share that. And I know that there were questions about the slides in terms of being able to share those out as well. I think that's
yeah. Like I said, I think I acknowledged or credited everyone who I borrowed information from. I should double check that just to make sure before I send that out. But I'll run through. I tried very hard to make sure I cited everything. But I have no problem sharing the slides.
All right. Well, thank you all. Have a great celebration tomorrow. 50 years is awesome, and we'll just keep it going. So unless there's any other conversation or last minute questions, I'm going to say thank you very much for coming, and be well, all of you. And we're glad that you were able to spend tonight with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Enid.
Bye. Happy Earth Day.
Happy Earth Day.
Can't see us. No.
Bye. Bye.